this AOC Bernie Sanders phenomenon.
Right.
And there's definitely a lot of momentum here when you look at the crowd size and you look at reaction. There's a huge crowd in Los Angeles. Of course, they've had huge crowds in the East. Then he goes to Coachella, and of course, there's already a huge crowd there. But, his reception was, you heard it, very, very warm. I'm wondering how that translates into a political viability or into a political movement, or is this the way political movements start, with the kind of germination that we're seeing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And let's start with this. There's never been an 80-something-year-old on the Coachella stage ever in history. And there may never be again. I mean, let's just tick down a couple things real quick, all right? It is absolutely remarkable to observers like me. Seriously, we talked about this back when he was running for president, that the person right now in the United States that is resonating most with young 20-somethings is an 80-something-year-old Bernie Sanders. That's number one. You just think about that. That ought to cause people in the Democratic Party be going like, hey, what gives here? Secondly, he has said again recently on national television, he considers himself still an independent, not a Democrat. And I think this is to start moving into the politics of this. I think there's a plus and a minus for this for the Democrats. One is he is getting crowds that nobody else is even attempting, right? Even at these town halls that people are trying to hold in Republican-leaning districts, et cetera, they might get a few hundred people and they're animated, right? But I mean, these are massive crowds in the tens of thousands. That certainly says something about the level of interest in what he is talking about, and the institutions that he is challenging, and the presidency that he's challenging. And in some ways, it's reminiscent of the start of the anti-war movement, right? Decades ago, when these kinds of rallies with this kind of demographic, now it wasn't by an 80-something, it was by people like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and others. But you know what? That's the kind of feel I think it has, at least in its sort of germination, the seed of it. You know what I mean, Mark?
Sure. In fact, that's a great comparison, the Vietnam stuff. That's really interesting. And, I wouldn't normally post this guy because he's a pain in our, he's kind of he's a MAGA head in our comments. But I think he does, on the heels of what you just said, this is provocative. Delwood Kelp writes, AOC plus Sanders spells McGovern redux. So that's a reference essentially to the fact that at the end of that run that you just described, the Vietnam War, the protests, 68, then 72. I mean, this was like the country was roiling with all of them. I mean, my God, the nation's cities were on fire through the 60s. Then you had this huge anti-war movement, massive crowds. George McGovern became the candidate, and what happened?
He got wiped out.
Yeah.
I mean, that for those people that don't know, go back quite that far, McGovern's election was an absolute disaster at the hands of Richard Nixon. Now, we could get into all the other things that went along with that, Watergate, everything else, right? But the bottom line was that for Democrats, it was a wipeout. So let me make my last point on this Bernie Sanders AOC thing. It is absolutely remarkable that Democrats as a party and an organization have kind of ceded the stage literally to Bernie Sanders. I mean, there's nobody else other than AOC taking that stage with him. You would think when you have crowds that large being generated that somebody from the party would want to step up, step out. Let me just throw out a bunch of names, right? A Cory Booker, who was on the floor of the Senate, a Josh Shapiro, who just had his house torched over the weekend, right? I mean, you'd think there would be somebody who'd say, you know what? I want to get up there and be one of the voices of our party. We can't just let Bernie do it as the independent guy who challenged our standard bearers for our party nomination. So it's sort of remarkable to me, Mark, twofold. One, the crowds are growing clearly and the enthusiasm is growing on the one hand. On the other hand, the Democratic Party has got to kickstart this thing if they want to get on board the bandwagon for 18 months from now in the midterm elections.
Such a great point about the fact that, the rest of the party is kind of quiet, oddly. CC Ryder says, I have no problem being a loud and proud Democrat. The left needs to stop eating their own and making excuses for being a Democrat. Go hard and be strong in liberal values, climate, voting, abortion. It's interesting. I mean, this is part of a much longer conversation that we will have as to what ideas and what priorities get traction with the voting public. But there is definitely a crisis in the Democratic Party because you've got people like CC Ryder who say, "Hey, you got to get it out there. You got your these are laudable goals and moral tenets that this party has that the other party does not have, and you've got to fly that flag." And there are others who say, "Oh, I want to be a moderate." You saw the Whitmer meeting in the Oval Office. I mean, it was there's a mishmash on the Democratic side, and as you say, everybody's MIA except for Sanders and AOC.
Yeah, and even amongst some of the well-known names. Now, Whitmer claims she got trapped into that meeting, etc. But the bottom line, she went to the White House willingly to talk about jobs in her state. And this is the challenge for a lot of people. It's a challenge for Whitmer right now. It's a challenge for Gavin Newsom in California. How do you get behind the things that you say, yeah, you know what? Whitmer's saying the tariffs are good in some sense for the guys in my auto industry. Okay, that's the conundrum she has right now. That's the rock in the hard place. And that's why she said she went there. Gavin Newsom is doing some really interesting things, as you well know. The issue on trans folks and women's sports a few weeks ago on his podcast, more recently in the last week, saying he's going to steer his own course with foreign nations over the tariffs. And now there's national experts saying he doesn't have any power to do anything seriously about that. So they're stuck, Mark, between, okay, some of this stuff we can get behind, some of it we can't, and they're kind of frozen in time, at least for right now, politically, I think, until there's more chinks in the armor that they feel like they can take advantage of with Trump.
Yeah, in a way, I don't blame Whitmer for trying to get some sort of understanding going with the dominant power force in America right now. It's a weird thing to say because you can. I get it. You're enabling. You're justifying. You're tacitly okaying this guy and his policies that are totally loony. This is the view of many Democrats. It's the view of myself on some level in terms of his policies. But on another level, as a governor of a state, you have a responsibility to those people who, occupy that state, your constituency, to make a deal.
Yeah. And
Very hard.
I think that's the challenge right now. There's the party is truly split. About half of the party thinks you go hard opposition all the time, 24/7. You don't work with Trump on anything, right? On the other hand, you've got people saying, look, we've got to deal with some of these issues that are on, say, Pennsylvania is true. Same thing, with petroleum, with manufacturing, steel, of course, in Pennsylvania, a really big issue in terms of its legacy, its heritage. So that's where they find themselves, stuck between how do you work on the things you want to work on and oppose the things vociferously you don't. I mean, one of my alma maters came out today, Harvard, saying we're not going to work with we're not going to cede to the president on these demands for our funding. Reportedly, that esteemed Ivy League institution gets about $1 billion in federal funding for research in these things. So there's a lot. I don't know how this is all going to shake out, but we're in some quite interesting territory right now, Mark.
Well, and then you see the federal government, and you're in California, and they're saying, hey, we're going to open up all the U.S. national forests, including California. In fact, actually, California is sort of going to be the test case, maybe, to timber production. They want to increase U.S. timber production by 25%, and they'll get all 18 of California's national forests involved. And there's no clear plan, but immediately expanding this timber production and doing it in the national forests there in California, that's a tough one to swallow if you're Gavin Newsom, but you have no choice.
Well, Gavin's caught between a rock and a hard place on that one, too. And interestingly, you bring this up, Mark. I was thinking about this issue coming on today because just last week, I met with the chair of a board of supervisor of one of the major forest counties in California. And he welcomes what Trump's doing. And the reason is this: fires. He said, look, even Gavin has been behind this deal. In fact, they've allocated state monies for thinning the forest. And you see this a lot. You can actually drive around now, like the west shore of Lake Tahoe. You can see it where they're doing it and have done it. So it does need to be done. Of course, environmentalists say very selectively, right? And that's kind of been Gavin's approach. But this chair of the Board of Supervisors said, look, we got to do this. He had a massive tens of thousands of acre fire in his own district just several years ago that completely wiped out a mountain town. And he says, we've been waiting for this kind of authority to get our forests cleaned up. In fact, there were feds, the Forest Service said 10 years ago where this town was. They identified this is a very high danger zone. We need to get in there and clean it up. It never happened, and the town burned down. So here again, the supervisor, Mark, showed me the map of where these national forest lands are all over the country. Check this out. You know where most of them are? In the blue states of Washington, Oregon, and California. So here again, these three Democratically leaning states are going to have to figure out how do they work with the Trump administration to thin out forests where they know they're danger zones, and how do they not just sort of open it up carte blanche to clear cutting, random.
Exactly. Well, the last thing that you've just said is so critical because there's a difference between forest fire remediation, fire prevention remediation type moves and the idea that you're just clear cutting. I mean, there it really is a difference. And I don't mean to suggest that they would do anything reckless. This administration, everything seems so clearly thought out, but I'm guessing they're on the clear cutting side. Okay. So, but
Mark, I will tell you, I'm sorry to interrupt. I didn't comment on because I didn't see and I don't know that there's yet developed specifics about how that's going to happen.
Yeah, there's not. So to be fair, there's nothing handed down, and that's what the Forest Service is saying as well. Hey, I wanted to play something for you. Then I want to get to Bukele, and I want to get to this guy who is languishing in an El Salvadoran prison. But Tony, can you play for Gary the Stephen A. Smith thing? He was asked about his presidential run, and Stephen A. Smith. He's a ESPN commentator and very high profile. Just signed this huge deal at ESPN and so he was on with I think Jake Tapper over the weekend on. It doesn't matter who he was on with. Anyway, he was on ABC. This is I think Jonathan Karl was talking to him. Go ahead, please.
The bigger picture here is that Elizabeth Warren was just on with you. You're going to have a multitude of Democratic representatives on with you. They talk and they talk and they talk, but what can they do? They position themselves to do absolutely nothing. I didn't hear anything about terrorists from the Democrats before the election. Trump had been preaching about this for the longest time. The way people decry his strategy, he's been bloviating about that. They said nothing about it. Instead, they talked about everything from woke culture to cancer culture to abortion rights and all of this other stuff. But that wasn't going to win the election. And that's what we have to look at. What is it going to take to get the job done? That's why somebody who's a sports analyst, for crying out loud, is in the daggone polls. It's not somebody big up in me. It's an indictment against a Democratic Party that doesn't have leadership and doesn't have a vision. And it's sad.
I saw you mentioned Bill Maher. I saw Steve Bannon was on with Bill Maher, and he was asked what Democrats he worries about. And the only name he mentioned as a Democrat he'd be worried about. So are you really thinking about running for president? Is this something you think?
Listen, I have no choice because I've had elected officials, and I'm not going to give their names, elected officials coming up to me. I've had folks who are pundits come up to me. I've had folks that got a lot of money, billionaires and others, that have talked to me about exploratory committees and things of that nature. I'm not a politician. I've never had a desire to be a politician. I just signed a contract extension with ESPN. I am very, very
pretty
happy
good one, too.
With my day job. I'm very happy with my boss. This is a pretty damn good one. Just right. It's a pretty damn good contract. I couldn't be happier. But here's the reality. People have walked up to me, including my own pastor, for crying out loud, who has said to me, you don't know what God has planned for you. At least show the respect to the people who believe in you, who respect you, who believe that you can make a difference in this country, to leave the door open for any possibilities 2 to 3 years down the line.
Okay, good stuff. So God, again, is in this plan. I love it when God sends those memos that, Stephen A. Smith, you got to be, leave the door open. Give me your thoughts on this. And the only reason I would dignify this with even a conversation this early, I know this is way, way early, but the other thing I think it reflects is sort of where we are in American society. where celebrity really trumps everything else. It trumps public service. It trumps policy. He's totally out to lunch with that tariff BS. Like if the Democrats had talked about tariffs, I mean, that would have been one more thing. What are you doing talking about tariff policy? It's not that, again, it's the celebrity that Trump brings when he talks about tariff policy. It's the way he talks about it, talking about being ripped off for years, et cetera. So, but the fact is, and then I'll shut up, I want to get your thoughts, but the fact is the celebrity here, Gary, I think is the thing that makes him the shimmering object right now politically.
Well, let's honor those who both the Judaic and Christian faith this week in their holy weeks and say, as far as we can ascertain biblically, God is decidedly nonpartisan. Okay, so let's just cut him a break here on Holy Week, okay, and say let's not try to pigeonhole him. But it's interesting you'd bring that up because that's a whole nother show. We should spend some time talking about the history of God in modern American politics, because from black churches to the Christian right, I mean, it's all over the map. Sure. But I think we can give God a pass on whether he's behind one of these guys or not. But here's the thing. I think you're onto something, Mark, about modern American politics. Now, let's just try as best we can to take the faces and the names off of this. But there's another guy who had no political experience, was a TV celebrity type person, and got elected president. There was also another guy who was a movie star type person who got elected California governor. And there was another guy who got elected to both. Now, everybody knows I'm talking about Ronald Reagan, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Donald Trump. So should it surprise us right now, at this moment in history, with the Democratic Party truly in its own estimations floundering, and as we talked about earlier in this segment, Mark, no clear leadership stepping forward to do what Bernie Sanders is doing, that there's a vacuum. And so Stephen A. Smith has made no bones. People love his kind of glibness, and he's thoughtful and he's challenging. Everybody's putting him on their air. So, it doesn't surprise me that at this point in time, establishment politics doesn't seem to be getting it done on the right or the left for many people.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. I mean, it's not just a celebrity; it's the void. It's something's going to fill that void, and in this case, now in modern American politics, it can be a high-profile celebrity who speaks well, as you say, who's glib, and has some. He's a rhetorical ninja in a way. He just keeps moving forward. I now want to get to Bukele and Trump, who were at the White House together today. The El Salvadoran president saying, I couldn't return this guy who was mistakenly imprisoned if I wanted to, and I don't know how I do it. Am I supposed to smuggle him back to the U.S.? I mean, it was this weird kind of dance, but clearly Trump and he were vibing, and then Trump even opened the door to perhaps the deportation of Americans who are guilty of any number of crimes that we don't want them in this country anymore. And if I can make that deal, I got to check with Pam Bondi. We want to do it within the law. But and the last thing I'll say is, they say they want to do it within the law, but the law, the highest court in the land, has said you got to return that guy who was deported mistakenly. And they're basically telling the court, can't do it. And they're shining it on.
Yeah. Well, at some point in time, we are going to reach the, immovable object, unstoppable force moment when the U.S. Supreme Court says, and this might be it, you got to do this and see, and we're going to see who blinks, right? Is it going to be the Trump administration? I mean, I'm guessing that what these two nation state heads are saying is, well, it's the prison system, and in El Salvador, it's the courts, and I'm the president, but I don't have, jurisdiction over the courts, and yada, yada, yada. They could get the guy back if they needed to. I mean, let's just be honest about that, right? These things have a way of being worked out. If the U.S. Supreme Court says it's got to happen, there's a way to make it happen. I think the larger concern, and that isn't to minimize at all this individual or his family and the other larger concerns about it, but Trump floating the idea of incarcerating Americans on foreign soil is a whole new ballgame, right? That is something that I think U.S. courts would have a huge problem with. You're going to start shipping U.S. citizens, bona fide U.S. citizens, to incarcerate them in other countries. I just think that is a non-starter from the U.S. Supreme Court on down. Now, I'm not a legal mind, but I can tell you from a political point of view, as well as I understand it, also about the judiciary, that's just a non-starter.
Yeah, so many in the chat agree. I mean, it seems as though that's an extraordinary bridge too far. Although I would have said that defying the Supreme Court in the way that they were being openly defied today in that meeting in the White House, that might have been a bridge too far. I mean, the Supreme Court hands down a decision saying you will facilitate the return of this guy. And these two guys who run these two countries of El Salvador and the U.S., they basically say, yeah, wish we could, just really can't get to it. Too busy.
Well, I don't think they said too busy. I think they're citing constraints that they believe prevent them from doing so. But
yeah, they didn't say too. But my point is, they've kind of claimed they sort of they couldn't do it if they wanted to type thing. He did say that I couldn't do it if I wanted to.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be the argument, about what they cannot do. But we knew we were going to come to this moment at some point. We'll see where it goes. Hey, real quick.
Yes, sir.
Back to that thing about celebrities, etc. I just want to comment on this from a sociological perspective. Okay, that's my undergrad background. The decline in the faith of institutions is really what led to what we're talking about now. In other words, the lack of faith, and this polling has been done now for decades, but the continued decline in the faith in institutions, from political parties to court systems to Congress to the presidency, is what has led us to where we are now, where people, even inside the traditional two-party system, are saying, I just don't know if those boys and girls can get it done on either side. And so therefore the Trumps, therefore the Stephen A. Smiths. I mean, I don't know where this leads, Mark. I think 28 is going to be a huge test, because we'll have open primaries for both political parties. There's not going to be a coronation of J.D. Vance. Everybody in the GOP is even making that clear. Trump has even said that in so many words. So that, to me, is going to be a real litmus test about where we are as a nation going forward.
I agree with you. I think the one thing that, and this is a very intriguing conversation, actually, it could go on for a while, but I feel as though the fire of the government is flawed and they can't help you. I feel that was really lit by the GOP in a big way. Reagan had the big, the line, which is so, what was it? The words that you fear the most, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. I feel like that fire was, I don't mean to, I'm sorry, to assign blame, but when blame, I think, can be assigned, it should be assigned. And I feel as though this is the culmination, if you will. You're so right to, I think, underscore the fact that the confidence in government has been eroded. But what you're seeing them going after now is institutions that were working perfectly well. I mean, as well as I do, the government does a lot of great things, and sort of running it down as a bunch of incompetence and waste, et cetera, that's really not fair to government, which does have incompetence and waste in it, but it also does a lot of great things. So now you get to Social Security. We've all paid into Social Security. This isn't some handout. And they have slashed and burned this very dependable institution in American government, to the point that now there may be interruption in checks, most certainly interruption in service. Speak to that. Like, the next step that's happened, in addition to putting Trump in power, you now have a real diminution of government power and some of the most dependable institutions of government power.
Yeah, let me get to the institutional problem in a second. Let me say politically, the Democrats have taken up that same call. With Trump back in office, there's questions. They're raising the questions about trust the courts. Should we reform the Supreme Court, right? That was a big conversation leading up to last year's election. They're asking the questions. Can you trust government under a Trump administration? So that clarion call is going out on both sides. Now, as far as the institutions go, here's what we can pretty much, from historical political perspective, say for sure. If Social Security checks start being interrupted, or major services that the average American counts on and knows that the government at this juncture has to provide, that is an absolute recipe for a complete wipeout of the GOP next year in the midterm elections and in 28. I mean, the old saw about Social Security being the third rail, the untouchable electric rail in politics. There's a lot of truth to that. And, you know, your political fortunes rise and fall about whether the average person feels like what the government is doing right now is helping them or hurting them. They determined last fall that the administration in power was not helping them very much. And in fact, probably hurting them to some degree. That's why they voted Trump in. You look at the exit polls, especially when it came to young Latino and Black males, that's what they were saying. Okay, they're not helping us. And the Democratic Party's talking a good talk, but they're not helping us. So I sort of say, you know, at your own peril, do you risk the things that Americans really care about when it comes to the ballot box?
All right, my time with you is really out, and I'm just going to ask you one last question, and it's about the election and the election process, which I think is going to become really relevant here, as you suggest, in the next couple of years. The new election requirements, the last name, and you can run through the dance again. They've raised the bar on your ability to vote in this country now in a couple of interesting ways that require sort of in-person re-registration and even in-person, oftentimes, legal changing of a last name, for example. I mean, so as to represent a married woman's new name such that she won't be disenfranchised. It's a weird thing because, well, you know the story, the tradition of taking on the husband's name, et cetera. So can you speak to the real impact that will have? And again, if maybe fill in a couple of blanks I've left out if necessary.
Yeah. Well, most of this is going to happen at the state level because a reminder to people, we hold 50 separate state elections to elect a president, for example. We don't hold one national one. That's why we have an electoral college. That's why you have state by state regulations on voting. So there's unlikely, Mark, to be a successful edict from Washington that is able to change this wholesale because there's a lot of power endowed to the states to do this. All right. But what I think you are going to see, and you already are seeing, even in states like California, is a very pared back version of this. For example, as simple as this, I'll just end with this: voter ID, right? Even in California, I think there's a very good chance that we're going to see a measure on the California ballot. You have to have a government issued photo ID that shows you are who you are when you walk into that polling place. Because remember, in places like California, you even have same day registration. So that's the bugaboo along with the voting, is registering and voting. I think you're going to see that pick up some speed. There's a lot of polling that's been done that the average person thinks, you know, that might not be a bad idea, at least that one thing. We'll see where that goes.
Right. It does seem to poll pretty well. So you're right. That's not some radioactive concept that there be some sort of a voter ID. Interesting. And of course, many view that as a voter suppression. Love our time together. I've taken advantage of you today. I think I kept you a couple minutes late. Thank you so much. You can find Gary across the iHeart Radio network and on CBS television stations nationwide. Gary, thank you. Look forward to next week. Gary Dietrich, everybody. Good stuff. By the way, Gary is brought to us every week by Bill Campbell. Shout out to Bill Campbell in Northern California at Remax Gold. If you are in Northern California, you're relocating to Northern California, you're leaving Northern California, and you want a highly respected real estate professional, Bill Campbell is your call. Text him or call him at Remax Gold, 530-448-7474, 530-448-7474. Bill Campbell at Remax Gold. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.